So thank you very much for joining us after lunch. I was wondering if anyone is going to show up. I'm going to talk about the topic that I think is actually the most important when we speak about protests, when we speak about revolutions and social movements. And we heard about this issue in several presentations yesterday and today. And the issue is actually public space and the spatial dimension of civil society, of social movements. And my presentation tries to summarize the empirical data on this issue and some theoretical and empirical reflections as well. The data the presentation is based on is a combination of my own research in media, in blogosphere, and interviews collected by Collective Research in Politicization. Now they are PS Lab. I have several names on the screen of the people who conducted the empirical study. I hope I didn't forget anyone. If I did, I'm sorry for that. So the data is not collected within a strategically planned and coherent research. These are rather data from very different empirical studies, but I hope it still will allow to draw some conclusions from it. The first thing that I think is very important to discuss is what is actually public space in the post-socialist cities. I'm going to speak about cities, not touching upon the rural areas. And I think it makes sense because we heard it yesterday and again today that the protesters were actually urbanites. So they were people living in cities and following something that can be called urban lifestyle. But the problem with, well, it is actually a problem with Russian cities is that the public space is not functioning as public space since decades in many Russian cities. What I mean by that is that when we use the narrow definition of urban public space and refer to squares and streets, some parks, we of course have all these components in all of the cities. But if we mean something more general when referring to public sphere and public space, then we encounter a problem. Actually, the public space of the city was not used for expressions of citizens. It wasn't used for communication in such a scale as it probably could be observed in some Western cities. Of course, people were always visiting public spaces, they were present there, but it didn't become an issue. So people never discussed the public space as something important for the city, for organizing life in the city. The other important issue here is also referred multiple times in this room and this conference, is that the mobilization in post-socialist Russia was also considered a problem by many scholars, which is probably the result of the problems of public sphere that I mentioned earlier. And I don't want to say that there was no mobilization, of course, and we know about many examples of mobilizing activist groups in different regions, not only in central cities, but also in regional centers. But again, this kind of mobilization didn't attract a lot of attention in the media as well. And the general impression that you can have of the post-socialist public life is that there is a lack of public life. There is a neglecting of public spaces, of public issues by the citizens themselves. And this famous metaphor about Russian citizens describes them as people locked in their apartments, in their small worlds, not having any interest for the life outside. Of course, it's a metaphor, and this definition and vision is somewhat limited, but we often encounter this kind of definition of post-socialist Russian public life. Another important thing here is that in recent years we observe gating in the cities. We see new boundaries, material boundaries emerging and framing this semi-public worlds of neighborhoods, of particular housing units. But we don't see a lot of attention to communicative and interactive spaces that would unite all these units. It seems that the picture started changing approximately in the same time as the protests against electoral frauds on the elections emerged. I deliberately don't put it in the direct connection because it is also always very tempting to say that actually this protest led to the mobilization. But I'm not quite sure that these two parallel developments, I mean the emergence of interest to public spaces in the city and the protests and the big social movements that we evidenced, that these two things are well, they are probably part or a consequence of some bigger issue, of some bigger transformation that we have to try to find. And here I want to remind you on the yesterday's lecture by Alexander Filipov, who was speaking about some new definition of civil society, some new vision of civil society emerging right now. And this is not the only reference I can make. There is a huge discussion on personalized politics going on right now regarding the Occupy Wall Street movement and other types of social movements that we can compare to what was going on in, and is going on in Russian cities right now. This is a new type of contentious politics, a new way to involved in public issues while remaining an individual, so not becoming part of a bigger collective, not becoming part of a sustainable solidarity group or something like that. I try to be very careful here, but I feel that it is a very interesting direction for analysis, trying to grasp this general transformations of the public sphere, of political life, and the patterns of participation that lead to this kind of processes. So I will just briefly give an overview of some empirical evidences from the recent years in Moscow. I want to show, by showing these pictures, I want to show how important space was during these protests. And starting with counting. So we all know from the literature on social movements that showing numbers of people, of participants, and counting is a very important issue. And we saw how important it was in this particular movement. So the police would say the numbers were lower than they actually were. The participants would try to increase the numbers. And it was the constant negotiation and competition between the parties. But apart from this very traditional issue, like as counting and showing numbers, there were several, I want to put it again in quotation marks, new forms. They probably aren't that new, but for Russian cities and for the media sphere, it was quite new still. That kind of participation and protest forms, they appeared in the mass media during this events of 2011-2012. Here I want to emphasize the three types of spatial behavior and protest behavior. These are Occupy Abai, which is obviously a reference to the Occupy Wall Street and the relevant events worldwide. Walks with the writers, which is also a spatial practice, and an interesting one. And the White Ring, Белое кольцо, which took place in Moscow. It was not repeated in other cities, but still it is also interesting to analyze this one. And the interesting part of all these events was that they took place in the circumstances of oppression. So they were kind of a reaction to the oppression of public protests. They were a reaction to the limitations imposed by police, by authorities on the protesters, and they are kind of spatial tactics of the protesters trying to avoid the limitations imposed on them. So first one is Occupy Abai. I'm not going to talk much about it, but I want to stress that this kind of event woke up some citizens in the sense that they suddenly happened to be in the urban space, feeling this space belongs to them, and they would state it quite clearly that it was their first experience of being somewhere outside with some people they didn't know before, and this public experience was kind of a new experience for them, and a very important one that would develop further. The second event is control walks or прогулки с писателями, walks with the writers, and you, of course, you know about it, and I probably don't have to speak more, but I think it's very it can be interpreted as a spatial tactics because, as Boris Akunin, the leader of this event, put it in his blog, it was directed on testing the limitations of the police state, of the authoritarian state, and it was directed on testing public space and public qualities of the space in Moscow. As a result, again, the citizens tried to reclaim the public space of the city. The third event I mentioned is the White Ring, which was a very interesting case also because it was very locally specific. So it was a ring, and you can see the map of Moscow, which has this circular structure. And the ring would go, the circles, I mean, the car drivers put white signs of protest on their cars, and thus showing their solidarity. And they would make these rounds around the center of the city, and I think it's a very nice metaphor that Alexei Levinson uses in his writing on the spatial dimension of the protest in Moscow. They were kind of making rounds around the center of the power and thus blocking it from showing who is the master here. Of course, it's a metaphor, but still a very interesting one, and I think that this White Ring in Moscow is a good example of spatial tactics in its creativity and innovativeness. So back to the rallies and to demonstrations. Again, the spatial dimension of this rallies was very visible to me when I read the interviews. I have put some quotations on the slide so you can read it, but the general impression that you get when reading the interviews conducted during the first days and weeks of the protest events, they give an impression of euphoria. So people finally find themselves among other people who are more or less similar to themselves, or even if they are different, they are still evaluated sort of positively. And they are not aliens. And this is an interesting parallel. There is an interesting parallel with, it may sound strange to you, but the similar words and expressions were used by our respondents in other projects dedicated to the creative spaces in St. Petersburg. When they would describe the public they met in this kind of spaces, they would say absolutely the same words. They would mention that these people look somehow normal. They are finally, so the respondents, they finally find themselves among normal people who they can associate with and not feel rejected, not feel alienated. So again, we spoke about emotions today, and this is a very important emotional dimension of this spatial practices. And another important and interesting thing here is the new emotional and unusual experience of the city. People who probably never went to such huge public events before, they find themselves in the city, and they find themselves in the city in a very unusual way, looking from the unusual perspectives at the same places they frequent in their daily lives. So here's again a quotation. Well, surely there is this idea of a rally or a demonstration as a new way to spend your free time and communicate with people, and the interviews had also that kind of evidence. Another, I will just briefly mention it, not going into details. Another interesting issue, a spatial issue, is comparing Moscow to other regions of Russia, which shows another dimension of the spatial inequality and distribution of power in the country. So Moscow was, of course, considered as the most central part of the protest. The protests in Moscow were considered as most significant, that people would go from other places to attend the rallies in Moscow, because they would feel it is there are more chances to be seen and heard when you are in the center of the state power. Okay, so I will finish soon. But another effect of this protest was also that the Moscow citizens would notice there are people in the regions, there are people protesting in other cities, and this kind of development needs discussion and needs research, but still I would like to stress that it also happened. Consequences. So as we know, there were several not very positive consequences of this kind of protest activity. The law on public actions and public gatherings was modified in the negative way, limiting the access of citizens to public spaces. We all know about the trials and charges for the activists and so on. But there was also a complex of social consequences, which I think is most important here. As my colleagues have mentioned earlier, there were some local structures developing from this bigger national level protest. And we can see that this experience of participation in the national level protest sort of made people more familiar with participation, with protesting, and they didn't feel like novices in this kind of activism. Another interesting issue here that is studied right now by some colleagues of mine is the local level urbanist activism, which is not always put in the political terms, so it's not always perceived as political activism, but it's rather presented as local level and very practically oriented kind of activism. And I want to finish with the idea, which I hope will be studied deeper and better in the nearest future, that probably this kind of local activism, which is not perceived as abstract and as big as some political national level issues, this is the future of political participation and contentious politics as such. And again, I will refer to the talk by Alexander Filipov yesterday. So thank you very much, and I hope you will have some questions.
Yes. It's a good opportunity to do right now. Okay.
I just got one comment and a question, because during your talk I thought that maybe because when there's different kind of protests, there is always a problem to find a space to do the event. And so in fact the struggle for the space appears, and then maybe this can be connected with one of your first ideas about we can connect them directly, but maybe the protest activities and the initiatives in urban space, but there is something more. And so maybe maybe there is some connection. I mean, the understanding that we get to find this, that we get to be in struggle for the space, just to find a place to have a meeting, to have an event. It may connect with just understanding that the space is a valuable source and that we got to struggle for it with the authorities, and so it can lead to just a right understanding of the space. And it's just.
Yeah, but I think it's only one part of the game, because it's not only about claiming the space for protest actions. There is this second part, claiming the space for everyday uses and for designing the space the way you want it to be, and it's not directly connected to the protest actions. But still, it somehow goes in the same line. These ideas appear more or less in the same time, and I think there should be something like a broader picture.
Obviously, the space is important, and also for many reasons. One of them having to do with the desire to meet each other, another with the idea that the participation is situation-based. Several reasons. But what can we say particularly about the space? For example, we obviously see, as you said yourself, that the protesters tended to occupy the symbolic representative places, so precisely the centers of power, which kind of contradicts with your general line that this protest is somehow situational alternative, is just about occupying space and not about taking power. Yeah, but precisely the space was all related to Kremlin and in Moscow there were more protests than here for this reason, and here also it was symbolic center. Why this strategy? Why is there no strategy of occupying outskirts, of building alternative spaces? It would be more logical. If Putin doesn't give us power back, then why not gathering all the middle class, as you call it, and lead it to Kupchina, and then do whatever you want in Kupchina. You know, there is a lot of space.
They're already there. The middle class occupied Kupchina for a while, but now they left. I mean, there was a project to sort of make Kupchina more popular. Yeah. Well, I think these two lines of analysis, they don't contradict each other, because there is this old tradition of taking power from the center and being in symbolically important places, of course, so we know, and we can definitely observe it in this protest of 2011-2012. But there is something else. This is what I wanted to say. So there is the traditional and the old school version of political protest, which we could observe. And there is something else, so the new school of political protest, which is more local, more like thinking about the closest environment, the people who are around you, not about Putin. And there are people who put it in that way. So they don't try to overthrow power. And they say, we don't care about Putin, so we are going to work here and now. And this is another logic, but somehow they come together, sometimes they just are in different places and don't relate to each other, but it all has to do with space in the end.
Okay, we can discuss only one question. One more question. Huh? Okay.
Just in this, there are also different levels of working with the space in this urban activism, etc. Because I think that what Zhelnina and Gatsan doing, it is really different from the things that maybe some people are doing themselves. Some producing something in their local space, in their own yard, or maybe in their own staircases, something like this. Because I think that Zhelnina and Gatsan maybe more politicized anyway that, for example, my grandmother is doing a little garden near the window.
Well, actually, it's a very interesting point because at the same time as the protests developed, we could observe how these small local issues became politicized. And of course, in the end, Navalny and some other candidates who were trying to become mayors of Moscow, they used these rhetorics as well. So they tried to use this willingness of people to participate in that kind of local and concrete projects. But we discussed it yesterday, I think, that actually your grandmother, she's not politicized because she's not trying to make a story out of her small garden. But the activists I kept in mind when speaking about these issues, they are trying to make a story. They are trying to put it on the media. They are trying to attract new participants. They are trying to sort of spread their ideology as wide as possible. So that makes a difference. That makes it more political in a way, even if they don't want to put it as political.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.